What is Code Deploy? So Code Deploy is basically an automation platform to allow you to deploy software to a large number of EC2 instances in a controlled way. So it's basically application deployment automation is for short. What it allows you to do is to define a workflow that allows you to build a web application and then deploy it to EC2 instances. It could be just a couple, it could be thousands, could be hundreds of thousands of instances in a controlled manner. How it pulls this off is by allowing you to define application specifications and then grouping your EC2 instances into what they call deployment groups. And to kind of give you background, we'll go forward. First we'll do advantages. So what are some of the advantages of using something like Code Deploy to push software to EC2 instances? One, it automates the release and deployment cycles. You can tie this into any kinds of CI or CD systems. It also allows you to track your application specifications, so the details of how your software deploys can become a part of your application and controlled in source code, just like the rest of the application that you're developing. Some of the other advantages is it plugs directly into existing CI/CD. So if you're using things like Jenkins or Puppet and Chef, it's designed to be flexible enough to plug into existing workflows for deployment automation. And it also works well with both just a static set of EC2 instances as well as dealing with things like auto-scaling policies and so forth. What are some of the drawbacks? Well, one, it's a deployment system that's tied directly to AWS. The application specification called AppSpec by Amazon is proprietary and very custom to AWS, which means it's not very compatible with other kinds of automation like Puppet and Chef, and you cannot use it inside your enterprise. You can only use it inside of Amazon's cloud infrastructure, so there's no taking it to Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or any of that kind of stuff. And the other one of the drawbacks too is it's not open source, so all of the details of the implementation stuff are all very much tied to Amazon's infrastructure, and you're kind of locked in. Cool. So how does Code Deploy work in more detail? So this is the structure of an application as far as Code Deploy is concerned. Within Code Deploy's web interface or through the command line, you define an application, and inside an application you define deployment groups, and deployment groups are what actually contain EC2 instances. So deployment groups are probably a synonym for what you might think of as environments. So as you build an application and you prepare it for launch, you take it from perhaps putting it into a testing environment and then into a staging environment and then out to production, right? So you end up making kind of 3 copies of the same infrastructure at different scales for a release process. So the way Code Deploy and Amazon allows you to display this is inside your application. In Code Deploy, you can define what's called a deployment group, and staging versus production and so forth. And it's a deployment group that actually contains EC2 instances. So these can be a single instance, they can be thousands of instances. It's completely up to you, and you can change the number of instances within a deployment group at any time, as well as a deployment group can be tied directly to an auto-scaling policy. So it's not necessarily tied to a static number of instances, but just some kind of policy about what instances get spun up and spun down. So that's kind of how you can define to Amazon what your application structure looks like, your environments look like. How does an actual deployment work? So you're writing software, you're building, an application, and eventually, your software builds an artifact of some kind. So some version, some release of your software that you want to push out to the world. So basically the way this works is you create that artifact, you push it into S3, and then from there you tell Code Deploy where the artifact is sitting in S3 and push it to deployment groups that you specify. So you can kind of do this in a linear fashion or any kind of order that you want. So for example, this workflow kind of just illustrates pushing to a number of deployment groups. This could have been my dev environment, my test environment, and then finally the production. So that's kind of how it works. It's sort of kind of a 2-stage approach, if you will. Is you build your artifact, you push it up to some place that Code Deploy can get it, which is usually S3. Code Deploy also supports GitHub if you want to put it in GitHub. And then you push it out into various deployment groups inside of the application that you defined with Code Deploy. How does the deployment actually work on an instance? So basically what happens is when you tell Code Deploy to push a deployment out to a deployment group, what it will do is it will go through each instance in that deployment group and perform this workflow, perform this upgrade, perform this deployment of that software. And you define what happens in each one of these steps according to what they call an application specification. And this is a file, it's a YAML-based file that you actually stick in your product's source code as part of the artifact, and it describes to Code Deploy what to do at each one of these steps. All of the ones in yellow, all the ones in these workflow in yellow is the ones that you control. So from stopping the application to before you start the install, after the install happens, starting the application back up and then validating that the application successfully upgraded and is back up and running. And another note to think about this is while an individual deployment is happening on an instance, you can actually control how that works. So you can tell, if your deployment group has 3 instances, you can tell them kind of which instances to upgrade first and which order to do it in. So that way you can also maintain a high availability to your product as well as do kind of rolling upgrades. So, and we'll see that a little bit when we do the example. And speaking of the example, I guess we'll go ahead and hop into building our very first Code Deploy application. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our first Code Deploy application. So the first step in all of this is we have to tell Amazon and Code Deploy what the application is and start defining some development groups. So the very first step to do this is we need to create a IAM role for Code Deploy itself. Code Deploy as a product is going to have to be able to reach out to S3 buckets on your behalf. It's also going to have to be able to touch EC2 instances and so forth, and that needs to be defined as a role and tied to Code Deploy in order for Code Deploy to function, because Code Deploy does not have access to your AWS assets, by default. So I'm not actually going to show you how to do that in this video because it's a little bit convoluted, and there's step-by-step instructions on Amazon's site, which I have linked in the report if you want to look at it. So I have already set that up, and we will look at some of the information from that, but we won't actually do that on the video. So anyway, so the next step then is to actually create the Code Deploy application. So you have to register your application with Code Deploy, and since I'm a command line guy, we're going to focus on doing most of this on the command line. So I'm going to go ahead and steal this, hop over to the command line, and go ahead and drop this in. So basically very simple. I'm going to go ahead and use the AWS command line for deploy and call create application and give it a name. I'm calling it demo app. So go ahead and throw that out there, and then you get a response. It looks like the app has been created. So that's a pretty easy step. If we want to go ahead and take a look over here at Code Deploy in the web interface, you'll see as I refresh, oops, back in. There we go. There's our app, demo app. All right, so inside demo app, there's really no information. So our next step is going to be to go ahead and set up a deployment group. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to make one for the moment, and this is where that Code Deploy IAM role comes in, as you need it in this command. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this sample over here. I'm going to go ahead and paste it in my little sandbox, and then I'm going to go and we're going to go ahead and look up that role. I already have the role up here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. Now remember, this is the role that allows Code Deploy to reach out to S3, pick up artifacts, and also log into EC2 instances and perform upgrades. So this is how we tie it, is that inside of our application, we're going to create our first deployment group, and we're going to give it this service role so it can actually get around. So let me go ahead and put this into the command line, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it is before we run it. So pretty straightforward command. You're going to create a deployment group, and remember, deployment groups are what contain the EC2 instances that you actually push builds to, push artifacts to. So you're going to tie it to the application by the application name right there. You're going to give the deployment group a name. In this case, I'm calling it the production group. You're also going to give it a deployment config, and this is a pretty important section. So this is the way that Code Deploy will roll out deployments to sets of instances. Now you can define custom ones, but by default they give you, I think, 3 different ones to choose from, and this one, this code deploy default one at a time, means that what it's going to do is when a deployment gets sent for a set of EC2 instances in a deployment group, it's only going to take one machine offline at a time, do the upgrade, see that it succeeds, put it back online, and then take the next one. So that way you can kind of do that rolling update. So if you have a group that has 3 machines, 2 of those machines will still be up at all times as the upgrade grows out. I'll just do one right after the other. The other kind of key is this next flag here, this EC2 tag filters. This is how, these tag filters is how Code Deploy knows which EC2 instances belong in this deployment group within this application. So the way that works is that you actually define a key name and a value on EC2 instances themselves, so that way when it's looking for these instances, it'll find them according to this key and value. And I'll show you how that works when we actually spin up a couple of EC2 instances. And then finally, you have a service role, and this service role is just that identifier that ties your code deploy, gives your code deploy instance access to these machines, so, and all these services. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and it's going to give me back an ID, a successful response. And if we update here on the web interface, we refresh our demo app, you'll see that there is now a production group right there inside of Code Deploy. So that is a good thing. So the next thing that we're going to have to do after this is we're going to have to do another rules and policy thing. So we need to create what's called an instance profile. And basically what this means is that you need to also give your EC2 instances that you spin up that are going to get applications pushed to it by Code Deploy ability to hit S3 and download those artifacts, because basically the way it goes is that when Code Deploy kicks off a deployment, it's going to find an EC2 instance that needs upgraded. It's going to run some software on that EC2 instance that's going to try to download that artifact from S3 or GitHub or whatever and execute the deployment. And so this instance profile is what allows that EC2 instance to actually read those S3 artifacts from your bucket. So anyway, also something I'm not going to do in the video here, but it's also just kind of a step-by-step thing. You paste some permissions and some roles into a group, and then you write the name down. So I'll have that in here. So now that we have kind of our rights and roles all sorted out, we've got our Code Deploy application defined, we got a development group defined. The next thing to do is to simply spin up some EC2 instances and get ready to do a deployment. So let me go ahead and copy this command, and I'll paste it in where it's a little bit bigger to read. So we're just calling AWS EC2 run instances, the standard instance run stuff. I am giving it an AMI ID. Now this is the standard Amazon Linux AMI ID. You can use any AMI that you wish. And then I'm also passing a key name, so I'm able to SSH into the boxes. I'm going to make them T2 micros, and then this is kind of the key thing, is that instance profile I was talking about that gives the instance itself the ability to log in and pull down S3 artifacts and run upgrades for Code Deploy. This is how you tie that in. And instead of doing 2 instances, I think I'm only going to do 1 since we're just doing a demonstration. So I'll do 1 instance, go ahead and run that. So that starts to spin up. I should be able to come over here, and what I'll do is I should be able to come over here and hit up EC2, and I should see an instance coming online, which we do, so that's good. It'll take a minute to load, but we got some other work to do while we're doing that. So one of the key things I'm going to steal here while I'm here, though, is the instance ID, because we will need that in our next command. So let me go ahead and copy that, and move over here, put that down, and go ahead and clear out that output since we don't need it. And then the next step is going to be, so now we have a Code Deploy application, we've got a deployment group, we've done our permissions, we're spinning up an instance, but the one problem is that there is no tying, there's no way to tie the instance we just spun up with the Code Deploy application or deployment group that we've defined. So that's the part that we have to do next, and that's also done with an EC2 command, and this is the one right here. So go and copy this. So basically what we need to do is we need to create a tag on the EC2 instance itself. So the tags actually live on the EC2 instance, and that's how they find, machines when they go to do deployment. So the command is pretty simple. All you need to do is take the instance ID and the tag that you have to define and go ahead and assign it to it. So put the command together over here on the right, paste it into the screen on the left, and now what you'll notice is that the tag here is the key is CDG, the value is demo app production, and if you remember, that's the same value that we defined when we created our deployment group, our production control group in our code deploy application. So I'm going to go ahead and assign that tag. This doesn't actually give you any output to show that it succeeded, but as long as it's an error, that means it worked, and you can check on it by heading over here to EC2, taking a look at your instance, and then hitting tags. And if you look down here at the bottom, let's go ahead and refresh it. Did I get the instance ID right? I might have got the instance ID wrong. No. Let's go ahead and pull out of it and come back. Come on, refresh. Well, actually, let's go ahead and run the command again because it doesn't seem to have tied it up. Oh, there it is. Okay, it just took a minute to show up. So there is our tag, CDG, and demo app production. So that means the tag is in place, so Code Deploy will find this instance when it's time to do a deployment. So that's good. So the only real thing left to do is go ahead and execute a deployment. But before we do that, I think we need to talk a little bit about how Amazon understands your software in order to do an installation of it. So what I'll do is show you a sample of what's called an application specification. So an application specification is a file that you need to include in your artifact, in your code base, that describes to Code Deploy on how to install your software, what scripts to run, what files to copy, all that stuff. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on the format of this file. It can be a bit complex and convoluted, especially for a complicated application, but what I will show you is the sample that I wrote with my example web application. So what you're looking at right here is a simple Python, the code for a simple Python application that runs a simple web server that just puts out a little bit of content. So if we take a look at the app spec, the appspecs.yml is the name of the file that you have to define for Code Deploy to understand what to do. And if you look through this just briefly, you'll see that I have a file section here that actually defines the source as the root, and this root would be the root of the software application, and where to copy the files. So in this sample, I'm actually just copying the files into the root user's home folder. It's probably not the best place for a production level application files to sit, but for our sample, it's just fine. And then there's these series of hooks. This is where I describe what scripts to run when. So to stop the application before the upgrade, to go ahead and make sure setup prod actually installs all the dependencies of the application. There's a few Python libraries that I depend on, that kind of thing. And then after the installation done is how do you start it back up? And I just have it telling you run start.sh. All these scripts are files actually in the source code. You'll see there's a setup prod right here, start.sh and stop.sh. I mean, none of these have anything too terribly exciting in them. Just simple scripts that run the Python web server. But this app spec is kind of the linchpin to the whole process. If it's not present, your deployment's not going to work. So it's important that you have it defined and that you have it defined correctly. And if it does error, it does show you kind of where it breaks down. So we have our app spec YAML, we have our application in Code Deploy, we have an EC2 instance, we have our deployment group. So now all we really need to do is take our web application and deploy it to Amazon through Code Deploy instead of, uploading it and installing it manually. So let me go ahead and grab what the command looks like for that. So the first thing that you need to do is, if you don't have one, and I'm not going to do this right now, is if you don't have an S3 bucket to hold your artifacts, you need to create one. But I already have one, so I'm going to skip that step. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab this push command. And let me make sure. So, oops, we are not in the right folder. So let me go ahead and move over there first. Sorry. So if we take a look, same folder, we have our application and all the scripts for it right there. The app spec YAML is in place. So we're ready to package and push this app to S3. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is paste that command in here. And it's all pretty straightforward. So, AWS deploy push, specify the application name. Remember, we created the code deploy application name of demo app, and then tell it where in S3 to store this. So this needs to be the bucket name and the key that you want the revision of this application stored under. So I'm just going to say V001, the very first push. So go ahead and push that. And it's going to come back and it's going to give you the scaffolding for the command you need to run to actually execute the deployment. So now remember, we haven't actually pushed the software to the EC2 instances yet. All we did was upload it to S3. And if you want to see that, we can actually just head over here, click Services, take a look at S3, head into this bucket here, and you'll see that there is a file sitting here that just got uploaded that's ready to deploy our application. That is our application code, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and take this scaffolding of a command and copy it, put it over here in my sandbox, but I'm not going to use it directly. The key part of all of this is really just the S3 location that it gives you back. So you'll see that it gives you kind of the bucket name, the key, and the E tag, which is kind of the version of it, the signature of the file you just uploaded. So we need that, but we also need the actual full command. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it out of my sample app. Go ahead and paste it into here. And all I got to do is update the line that tells where the S3 stuff is at. Go ahead and copy this to here. Paste it, and now we have a command. So let me go ahead and put this over out of the sandbox and into the terminal window and take a look. So create deployment, AWS create deployment, pretty straightforward. The application name that you're targeting, the S3 location of the artifact you just uploaded. So you'll see the key is 001, the bundle type's a zip, and there's the E tag, which basically represents the hash, the MD5 sum of the file. Which group you're trying to push to, so this is very important. You need the deployment group. We're going to deploy to the only one we have, which is called production. And then finally, you're going to specify the config name, which remember is one at a time. Now, since there is only one instance in this deployment group, it's going to take that instance down, upgrade it, and then put it back up. So if there were more, it would just kind of roll through it one at a time. There's other configurations that will let you take half the instances offline at once, or 1/3 of them, or whatever, to kind of push a little faster if it's thousands of machines. But since it's only one, we'll just do one at a time. And then just description of what this deployment is about. So this is the first push of the application. So go ahead and run that, and it's going to go ahead and give me a success message of deployment ID. And then if we're quick, we can come over here, hit refresh, and we'll see that the production deployment group is in progress. And then we can kind of sit here for a few seconds. Since it's only one instance, it shouldn't take very long to deploy. And let's refresh. Still waiting. Oh, while we're waiting, why don't we go look up the IP address of the server? So the EC2 instance IP address, we're going to need that to kind of prove that our application got deployed successfully. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab the public IP really quick. And then hopefully by now, hit refresh. Hopefully the instance will have successfully deployed. Still waiting. All right. Well, let's give it a minute then, and we'll come back as soon as it's ready. All right, so welcome back. What I realized happened is I forgot one small step when preparing your EC2 instances for Code Deploy. In order for an EC2 instance to work with Code Deploy, you actually have to install the Code Deploy agent yourself. Amazon Linux doesn't even come with it pre-installed because it is a background service that waits for deployment requests. So the deployment I sent off actually failed, but it only failed because the instance, wasn't listening for requests. So all I really need to do is go ahead and just re-kick off the deployment and just bring up the command from last time. No changes. Go and kick it off, and I'll kick off a second deployment. So if we come back over here to the web interface, you'll see that there's that first failed deployment, and there's a new one in progress now. So Now this should only take a few seconds for it to actually run. And give it just a minute. So the Code Deploy agent is a little piece of software that you have to install. It runs on Linux and Windows. It just takes a couple of commands to install. It's very simple. It's all documented in the report. And now if we see it refresh again, you'll see that our deployment has succeeded. So how do we know that it actually worked? Well, you can see details that Code Deploy did complete successfully. However, the best way to test it is to actually just try to go to the IP address and see if our web application is working, and it looks like it is. So lo and behold, we just deployed a piece of software through Amazon AWS Code Deploy to a single EC2 instance. So this might seem a little convoluted and pointless to install a piece of software on a single instance, but if you had thousands of Amazon EC2 instances that you're managing, a tool like this would be a very efficient way to roll out a particular build of software to all of them reliably, and Amazon manages the fact that they all got deployed to and what version's running and all that kind of stuff. So that is a quick teaser of the demo. There's a lot more information in all the documentation that I'm supplying on best practices and other little tidbits about how this actually works. So hope you enjoyed it. All right, thanks, bye.